gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining today's Regional Issues Forum. Before we begin, please ensure that you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note all audio connections are currently muted and this conference is being recorded. You are welcome to submit written questions throughout the meeting, which will be addressed at the Q&A session of the meeting. To submit a written question, select All Panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, then enter your question in the message box provided and send. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, we will now begin today's meeting.
Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to the Regional Issues Forum, also nicknamed the RIF, part of the EIM. And thank you all for those who are on the webinar connected through WebEx. And you must have got the WebEx instructions and details. This is Vijay Satyal, the new chair of the RIF, taking over from Pam Sporberg, the former chair and an excellent veteran of the RIF for a long time. And I have with me my colleague Josh Walter of Seattle City Light as the vice chair. And we have a couple of former RIF members, I see, liaisons in this room and new ones. So we're going to go through introductions real quick for all of you in the room. Please feel free to grab the microphone and introduce yourself and your role, and especially if you're a RIF sector liaison, to introduce yourself with the sector you represent. That'll be great. And before we get introductions, I do want to also remind everybody the same COVID-19 precautions exist. That was expressed in the YRAP-CREPC meeting. If you don't feel well after you get home, to at least notify Emily Hughes and me so we can just keep everybody informed. Thank you. We'll go in the room from, we'll start to my left and then we'll go around the table and everybody can chime in.
Holly Taylor, ISO Manager of Regional Affairs.
Emily Hughes, California ISO Regional Affairs.
I'm Matt LeCar with Pacific Gas and Electric, and I'm also the sector liaison representing the participating transmission owner sector.
Hey everyone, Meg McNall, the law firm of Thompson Coburn. I represent Six Cities Group, which includes the cities of Anaheim, Azusa, Banning, Colton, Pasadena, and Riverside, California. And I am the other PTO sector liaison.
Therese Hampton, I am here on behalf of the Governance Review Committee giving a presentation about the GRC questions for the RIF.
Josh Walter with Seattle City Light. I am one of the EIM sector liaisons and the vice chair of the RIF.
I'm Doug Marker, Bonneville Power Administration, Government Affairs. I am not a sector liaison. Alex Spain cannot be in person here today, but I am participating on the panel, and I am the PMA liaison to the body of state regulators.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dawn Honestcourt. I'm with Southern California Edison in the Regulatory Affairs Agent section.
Ian White with Shell Energy North America. I'm a RIF sector liaison for the IPP and marketer sector.
Kathleen Colbert with Vistra. I am also an IPP and marketer sector liaison.
Kalia Savage with Portland General Electric.
Hi, I'm Cameron Yurkowski with EDPR. I was once a RIF liaison and I'm currently on the Governance Review Committee. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
And I just should say that Cameron's amongst the few founding members of the RIF from 2014. Thank you.
David Rubin with NV Energy.
Project. Marcy Martin, Salt River Project.
Robert Kanzioka, Energy Imbalance Market Governing Body member.
Right here, Northwest Energy Coalition.
Amy Sapinka, BC Ministry of Energy. Eric Eisenman with PG&E, and I'm also on the Governance Review Committee.
This is Andrew McAllister from the California Energy Commission. I'm not on any of the committees or subcommittees or anything. I'm just here out of interest.
Sydney Welter, Western Resource Advocates.
I'm Laura Rennick with Weeb.
Maury Galbraith with Weeb.
Jim Baggs with Seattle City Light. John Prescott with the Western EIM governing body.
Uri Lee with Weeb, Western Interstate Energy Board.
Thank you all. I think not knowing how many people are on the WebEx, Emily, should we just speak the names out quick or we can move forward? Okay. Thank you all for those who are online. We're not ignoring you. I do want to do two more small procedural matters before we get into the agenda. One thing I should introduce as my own representation, which I do not do well, is I represent the public interest sector, which is part of the PIO and the consumer advocate sector. And I think my colleague, Jamie Stamatson from Montana Consumer Office should be online. So that's our joint sector representation. The couple of more things I want to bring up. Through the entire 3-hour meeting today, we will engage everybody online, but if there's questions or comments, we'll try to first take feedback from the sector liaisons who are online, and then, of course, everybody else. And the entire public, anybody has ideas or thoughts to raise, the agenda does speak to having a public roundtable item to be discussed later. I was trying to get the agenda up here, but maybe it's not. On the screen, if you all can see, this is the RIF composition, and this is basically the intended team members engaged in different ways on the different agenda items today. The one other item I would like to bring up is technically, and Matt has been very kind to help me remember some of the procedural aspects of RIF. In the past, we used to have a secretary to take notes and take summaries. But with the advent of our amazing WebEx and Zoom capabilities, we have the recording aspect today. So we're going to rely on the recording means to take a summary, and then I'll try to go back and listen and write a debrief. But I am going to request for our next RIF sector liaisons coordination meeting taking place on May 26th in Folsom, we will request us all to rotate as liaisons to be somebody to be a secretary. Just want to be agile, but yet not too formal. I'm going to give it to Josh. If Josh, you have anything else to bring up before we run the show?
No, excellent start. Looking forward to the conversation. Nothing to add.
Great. So our first agenda item is, as you may see, we're catching up on time again, is the future of RIF. But before we do that, it seemed best that we first bring everybody to the current day in terms of what is RIF, why, and what kind of work it takes on. So no one better than Matt LeCar with PG&E, who has known RIF pretty well and often helps be the side rails to keep us and me straight. So I'll give it to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. I think I've been to all but one of the RIF meetings in person, although I was not always the sector liaison. I'm certainly I think the longest currently sitting member of the liaison. So I have the pleasure and privilege of sharing some institutional memory of, kind of who we are and how we got here. So if we can pull up that was the list of liaisons. Okay. So to remind everybody, the Regional Issues Forum dates back to the dawn of the energy imbalance market. It was envisioned by the Transitional Committee that created the other governance institutions as the stakeholder body, the stakeholder outreach. And to this day, it's worth remembering that those of us who participate in the ISO's formal stakeholder process, right, there is a decisional process by which stakeholders communicate their comments, their concerns. They have all stakeholders in the formal process have the same opportunity, including making public comments before the board and or governing body in their decisional meetings. The RIF was viewed and remains, per its guidelines today, more of an informational venue. It was really viewed as part of the outreach and community building as we started to hold events in other states, include EIM participants from non-California states, as a means to get to know each other, first of all. I think of it as sort of the meeting the in-laws. We got together in this market and we kind of needed to suddenly understand where each other was coming from, including who the consumer advocates were, who the environmental advocates were, who the regulators and that whole community in each of the other states. Most of us didn't have that background coming in. I think we've built up quite a bit of muscle in the regional space over the last 6-7 years. So I think it's fair to say, at least the comments that I've seen and heard, the Regional Issues Forum has been very successful. The governing body members appreciate, being able to attend or listen into our events. Many of the, stakeholders frequently tell us that, they learned a lot. They appreciated both the selection of topics and speakers and the kind of networking opportunity at our events. So, not to get ahead of the panel that's coming up, but I think it's fair to say we want to build on that and, not discard what's working today. But there's certainly a strong interest as we start to look towards EDAM in where RIF can evolve into. And so the other thing I want to remind folks in terms of the structure, the institutional structure. So there are founding documents that the Transitional Committee created that establish the energy imbalance market, its relationship to the CAISO and the CAISO's tariff. Separately, both the RIF and the BOSR are essentially self-created institutions, one by the state regulators and one by the stakeholder community, that have their own institutional life. So we have a set of operating guidelines that govern the RIF meetings, our liaison sectors. Those operating guidelines inhabit an interesting space. They're not tariff. They don't require approval by a regulator. They're organizational documents like a charter. And to change those documents, we have to submit recommendations for changes via the governing body. I believe the governing body for the EIM approves changes to any of the EIM rules and changes including to the institutional documents. So that issue, or that, I'll say, opportunity, came up with regard to the first round of Governance Review Committee changes. So the Governance Review Committee was convened about, help me out, 2 years ago, 2019, late 2019, I think it started, to take a fresh look at the governance requirements for current real-time only EIM participation and the rules of the market, although, certainly with an eye forward towards where we might be headed under EDAM. And that first round of changes included, a bunch of EIM governance changes, as well as some of the changes to the RIF that the RIF liaisons approved of and recommended. So it's sort of a bank shot, but we use the vehicle of the Governance Review Committee and their recommendations to also put in front of the governing body some changes to the RIF. So I'm going to quickly cover what those are. One thing that, again, dates back to the early days of EIM was a restriction in our guidance that the RIF, as a non-decisional information sharing forum, should not supplant or replace the ISO's decisional process, including the, initiative, what's now working groups, but stakeholder meetings where ultimately comments from stakeholders are presented, typically by ISO staff today, to the board and or governing body as part of the decisional package. For the first round of GRC changes, we've now lifted that restriction. So we found it was too confusing and not at all helpful to try and ring fence, what issues were potentially active in an ISO initiative somewhere, what issues were therefore okay to discuss in a RIF and what weren't. It didn't feel all that necessary to having a good public forum for discussion. I think there's still, at least in my mind, an understanding that the RIF shouldn't be an alternative to the formal stakeholder process. We're an adjunct. We're another place where people can get information, share views, perhaps develop coalitions of interest or consensus positions. But it still has that, but now we have the opportunity at least to consider whatever issues stakeholders want to put forward for discussion. There were also, and I think Vijay hinted at this in the introductions, some changes to realign the sectors. So, it may seem like a long time ago, but there used to be this idea of adjacent balancing areas as a sector that we had to reach out to. We pretty much absorbed all of them. I mean, EIM continues to grow, as we heard. There were two new entrants that successfully joined this week. So we've found new homes for each of the sectors. EIM entities now have, I believe, 2 sector liaisons. We have a separate single liaison for our federal power marketing friends, and then the public interest consumer advocate sector. I think we formalized that it's one from each. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're one large happy family.
Yeah.
With 2 subfamilies in it.
Yeah. And there were some other minor wording changes that I frankly don't even recall what they were. But I think, at least from my perspective, we've kind of got it right for the time being. I'm sure there could be other changes as things evolve. But the key here is that, I'm not a lawyer, but I understand the concept of standing. Like who represents a sector is really important. We all want to feel, I think, for the RIF to have legitimacy as a voice for stakeholders, all stakeholders have to understand where they belong in this scheme, right? And there has to be a place for your representation and your sector interest to appear. So hopefully we've got it close to right, but that's another issue that we can take up. Sorry, what was the last bullet there? Can you go back one? And then the last minor change, but I think it's according to the RIF, kind of the same formal status as the BOSR, and if you look over on the CAISO balancing area or the CAISO Board of Governors agendas, typically the DMM will similarly have a kind of standing place on the agenda to present to the board or the governing body in the case of the BOSR. So now the RIF chair is invited to present at each of the governing body or joint authority meetings and share an update on what the RIF has been discussing, whether there are events coming up, and what agenda items we foresee bringing forward. So I think it's a nice kind of crystallization of the stakeholder role in the broader governance framework that we've got today. Just to sort of transition and wrap up my piece, I'm happy to take any comments or questions. I wanted to highlight, what are common themes in the evolution of the RIF to date, and there's sort of the tensions at the boundaries of who RIF is and the role we play. One is this tension between an informational role versus advocacy. And we certainly, at least I understand very well that in the full RTO, the multi-state full RTO framework, there are formal voting committees of either stakeholders or members. And standing is a defined thing. Who is a member of an RTO. It's actually probably defined in their tariffs. The stakeholder advisory committees have voting rules. We haven't crossed that Rubicon yet as a RIF, and maybe we will, or maybe the RIF will continue under its current more loose structure and some other body will be set up. But I just want to identify that, you know, the question of structure and function are very closely related. So the function of the RIF as a information sharing, networking, event planning body works well within the loose structure that we have today. If we were to move into more of a voting and advocacy role, you know, on behalf of stakeholders, I would think that the RIF would need a more formal structure where we clearly identified, you know, even within our sectors, we don't have strong rules about how to vote for our representatives. You know, these days, I think we typically put in an ISO market notice when we're going to have a call, but, you know, it varies from sector to sector. So again, if you're moving into a role where you're going to advocate for decisional outcomes, I think you need a more appropriately formal structure. I've touched on the issue of standing, but I wanted to mention, you know, in the formal CAISO stakeholder process, everybody who's in the RIF still has the opportunity, and most of us do submit comments in our day jobs. So for the RIF, whatever that it means for the RIF or son of RIF to submit comments, one of us would, you know, someone would have to, in addition to the comments they are already writing and slogging through in their day job role, would have to also write the RIF comments, right? And it's not just the burden of doing that, it's who would I trust to take up the pen and transcribe my views and represent them in front of the decisional bodies, right? Whoever is going to do that work, I would think that they're putting, you know, a lot of their blood, sweat, and tears, and probably, you know, some of their opinion into whatever they put together. So that, to me, you know, I'm again just identifying the issues that are coming up as you move towards that more advocacy posture for a stakeholder group. You have to think about who is representing the views of others. And I would say, you know, even within, I think that the sector framework has served us well so far. And my own personal view would be to keep that for as long as it's useful. But I will say, even within sectors, you know, Meg's clients and I don't necessarily see eye to eye on every issue. We may individually see eye to eye with other sector participants in other sectors, right? So there is no clear dividing line of stakeholder interest that cuts across every issue. So the last point, you know, so I've covered this sort of information versus advocacy, the standing and questions of who votes in what sector or how you vote and count heads. I mean, there's also, like, I represent a utility with 5 million plus electric customers. You know, we have a lot of skin in the game, right? And that question of, you know, what does it mean to be a stakeholder? You know, I don't know how many employees WRA has, but, you know, if Vijay tomorrow decided to start his own environmental advocacy firm with one employee, part-time, would he have the same vote that he has today representing WRA? Would he have the same vote that, you know, PG&E has representing 5 million customers? I don't know. It's a very hard, once you sort of step out onto that ledge, it's a very hard problem to weight these different interests, right? So the last one, and I already kind of touched on this, is the question of burden. I think we as a liaison team, you know, we don't spend a huge proportion of our time, but it's a commitment to participate in these discussions, plan the meetings. You know, I've been in a couple of the officer roles. You know, that's a bigger commitment. You also have to do a lot of the outreach with the governing body and the other institutional parties. We ought to think about, you know, burden sharing, but, you know, if we're going to take on more role for the RIF or the RIF liaison team, we need to think about, what's a fair way to allocate that burden among the membership. So that's my framing. And I'm going to hand it off to Therese, I think.
Yeah, thank
Unless
you.
there are questions or comments.
If you have any burning questions of what Matt said, you can bring it up now, or we can just hold. We kind of want to keep up on the time frame, but Matt, thank you for that very good summary and background. Before I give it to Meg, who's going to introduce this whole next item, including Theresa's presentation, I do want to do 3 thank yous that I totally forgot. One is to Weeb staff and Maury Galbraith for allowing us to work with Holly, Taylor, and Emily for setting this meeting up right after the wide upcrepsy. So I really appreciate the logistics coordination and any other hard work the AV team and Eric and his team had to do. I also want to thank Thomas Coburn Law Firm and Sanyo Gas Electric again. Thanks, Chris, in the back, for helping set up the reception last evening, which really worked out very well because everybody needed a beverage or two to shake things up. And the third person I really want to thank is Emily Hughes, who's done phenomenal work to help us, prep us, and these meetings don't happen without Emily. So thank you. Now we go to Meg, and it's your show. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. I am going to just briefly, we've already done introductions in the room, so I'm going to hand things off to Therese Hampton to give a presentation on the current activities of the Governance Review Committee, and with a particular focus on some potential changes to the Regional Issues Forum that could be considered in connection with possible expansion of the ISO day-ahead market. So, Therese.
Thank you, Meg. And if we can go to the next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you just a really brief process update on where the GRC is at, and then focus in on the stakeholder elements of some of the questions that we have out there, which really they are questions about this forum, which I did have the pleasure of being a part of for many years, and I have watched it evolve. Every year, we kind of talked about every year, it just got better and better as far as what it was able to do. And so I think that's part of the reason why both stakeholders and the Governance Review Committee are looking at it to say, where could this go? What's on the screen right now is the list of Governance Review Committee members. This is a stakeholder body that has been asked to come up with governance review or governance changes, proposed governance changes that they would put forward to the ISO board and the EIM governing body for their approval. We just finished a set of recommendations last year, and now we're looking specifically at recommendations that would be in place for the day-ahead market. A couple of things just to note from a process perspective. We've heard very clearly from stakeholders and intend as a governance review committee that we wouldn't put recommendations forward for governance changes. We would only put them forward with a market design change. So there wouldn't be governance changes made prior to the approval of an EDAM market design. So they would go forward in tandem. If we go to the next slide, we had a meeting on April 29th. The recording should be on the website. If you missed it, there's a full set of slides. This is going to be a select set of slides. There's a full set of slides out there available, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things before we get into the stakeholder aspects. The GRC uses principles and decision factors to guide its decision making about which governance recommendations we would like to put forward. There's just 2 things that are noted here. One is the overarching principle that the GRC uses. This has not changed from what we had the last time. We kind of looked at it, we tweaked it to put an S, at the end of markets. But otherwise, we really are striving for governance of the Western EIM and the EDAM that provides stakeholders throughout the West confidence that the structure represents the markets as a whole and represents and considers the interests of all stakeholders. That hasn't changed. That's the overarching principle. We did add 3 new principles that we are recommending to add. You will see these in a straw proposal when it comes out. You'll have the chance to comment on those, but we felt like based on the comments that we received in our scoping process that these were 3 new additions that were relevant for EDAM. The first is seek where possible to enhance the autonomous nature of the Western EIM governing body. We use the word autonomous versus independent so that it's not confused with FERC's independent standards. Both bodies meet FERC's independent standards. We really want to get to this autonomy concept. The second is to make sure that any modifications we make recognize that there are full ISO market participants that are in the ISO balancing authority area that have been in this market for 20 plus years and have a different decision option about their future participation. So we want to respect that and make changes that respect that. And then third, that we are looking at options that are thinking about in some ways that either support or advance a potential governance structure appropriate for a multi-state regional transmission organization. I will say we got questions about this at our public meeting. We're not advocating for a regional transmission organization. We are simply looking at governance options and weighing those to say that we would look towards those that are laying a path towards that if the parties in the region decide to go that direction. So we go to the next slide. This is actually the last slide, or close to the last slide of our presentation on the 29th. These are all the things that we have out for conversation. And the stage of the process that we're in right now is in the full slide deck, we have questions that we've asked around each one of these. And we're going through this process through the month of May of kind of informal outreach. We've tried to put our names out there as much as possible. We want to talk to you about these issues. And we actually do, the way we talked about it last week is we want to invite you into the dialogue that the GRC is having. The questions that we put in the slide deck are the questions we're asking each other. And so we want to have those conversations with all of you. And we think they're conversations. They're better said as conversations. So you might get you might get a request for outreach. If you don't get a request for outreach and you have stuff you want to tell us, let us know, call us. You can also email CAISO initiatives. You can email questions or comments and they can get it to us, or you can send a note and we'll just be sure to get in touch with you. Here are the main things that we're looking at. The type of delegation of authority to the EIM governing body. Do they get primary decision authority, or is it joint authority? If you recall, they previously had primary authority, but over a very kind of select number of issues. And in the last governance review recommendations, we recommended that we move to joint authority over a broader set of issues. So the question now is, do we continue with joint authority and potentially modify the scope of that, or do you look at a primary authority model? Then the second question is scope of that delegation of authority. We're looking at lots of different scope options, and so they're listed in there. We've got a fair amount of discussion on stakeholder role and market design, which we'll talk about. And then we are talking about the ISO Board of Governors nomination process and wondering if there isn't a way to align both the nomination and the selection criteria. Certainly we recognize how the ISO Board of Governors are appointed is not within the scope of the GRC. However, there are governance documents about the nominating committee and the selection criteria that are governance documents that we could have input on. And then lastly, talking about aligning or creating maybe a mission statement for the ISO Board of Governors that looks similar to what you have for the EIM governing body. The EIM governing body has a pretty clear mission statement that talks about looking at all market participants, those within California, maintaining the benefit for those that are within the California Balancing Authority area, but also those in all parts of the West. And so maybe trying to align those as well. Those are the big issues. There's also a question that's not on this slide that talks about what are those mileposts, what are those kind of major markers to getting to governance evolution that might be important to kind of lay the foundation or framework for a governance that would be appropriate for a regional transmission organization. That's a question that's in the slide deck that when we do this informal outreach, we'll ask folks about. So that's the big picture of what we're doing. That's the process update. Now we'll dive into the stakeholder questions that are intended to seed this good conversation. So we actually did a lot of work on stakeholder engagement in the last governance review, specifically this concept of an advisory committee versus the regional issues forum. In fact, it was also an issue in the transitional committee, the very first governance process that created the regional issues forum. And but what's happened since that process last time and where we are today is we continue to receive, I actually think we had even renewed or different comments about really the desire for more stakeholder involvement in the process. And so what we've, and with the kind of development of both the Western Resource Adequacy Program and the SPP Markets Plus, which has this member or market participant focus or committees, there's a question about could there be something like that. We received comments about could you match a kind of structure like that. So for this conversation, just so that we all have the same terminology, a market participant is somebody that has load, transmission, or generation assets in the market. That would be the term that we would use for this discussion. A stakeholder is just a broader definition of anybody that actually has interests, NGOs, policy advocates, consumer advocates in the market. So the questions that we have for the Regional Issues Forum is, should there be a markets participant committee, or should there be broader stakeholder-driven committee to drive market design? And does it replace the Regional Issues Forum, or does it expand the Regional Issues Forum? For the body of state regulators, the questions are, does the body of state regulators' role change if there's a participants committee, which we heard some perspectives for those that were here over the last couple of days. We heard some perspectives from some regulators that say, yes, for some of them that does seem important to them. And what changes to the scope and mission of the body of state regulators are needed, if any? So we go to the next slide. I love this graphic, just going to say that. But maybe not everybody does, or maybe it's not as clear as I thought it was. So I'm gonna walk through it. So what it's intended to show is there are two things that you need to think about in the stakeholder process, and what's across the horizontal line in the middle is how inclusive are you being in who's involved in the process, right? Is it less inclusive? And on the right-hand side, you're focusing just on market participants, so it's less inclusive. And on the left-hand side, which probably, I wonder if the lefts and rights are helping, because it's more inclusive, meaning it's everybody, it's any stakeholder that might be interested. And then the top half of this is the level of influence you might have on the market design, and the bottom half is how much influence you might have on the market design. So in the bottom right-hand corner, right, this is, you're having the most influence on market design, but it's less inclusive than other options. So, and what's noted there is like SPP, where market participants are actually making the market design decisions. In the upper left-hand corner, you would have more inclusivity, so more people involved, but less influence on market design. It's more just input. It's not decision making, and that would be kind of where people feel we are today in this process, where stakeholders are asked for their input. It's a very democratic process. Anybody can participate, and the decisions are not made in that stakeholder space. We've got a couple of other options on there. You might have market participant working groups that give input, but maybe aren't decision makers. And then we've got this lower left-hand corner where there is example in MISO where stakeholders, so all inclusive, are making market design decisions. So we used this to kind of evaluate and think about what are some options for us to consider. So if we go to the next slide, we did a pro-con chart, like we love to do in this industry, right? So we've got the market participant-driven decision-making and the stakeholder-driven decision-making. If you're in the room, you probably can't read this. And I think as we've had it presented both on Friday and then at the CRPC meeting, you will probably, not agree with every pro and con on this list, and you may have others that we didn't capture, but we try to capture the big ones. And the the reasons that people advocate and say that they want a market participant driven process where the decisions are made really more from market participants is they really have the financial consequences at stake. So they have to live with the consequences of this, and it assures that they have buy-in in the solutions. The cons on to that is that there are other entities that have impact and can get disenfranchised by that model. They don't feel like they have a voice, that decisions are made before they ever get to be a participant in that. And they have concern that market participants may not actually be able to think about all of the things that they think are relevant in the decision maker, so in the decisions, that they just don't have confidence that you have the full perspective that they want. On the stakeholder driven side of things, I won't go back to one of the cons. I'll just kind of note it as a pro here. There is a pro to the stakeholder-driven approach is that it's consistent with the existing ISO model. One of the cons of the other one is that it's a major shift from where we are today. One of the benefits of the stakeholder-driven is it integrates well and it is very inclusive of all the ways that people might be impacted. It's also very complementary to the body of state regulators' role as well. Some of the cons is that it can be very intensive, resource intensive, and it's also can be quite technically detailed, and not everybody is positioned for that. And there is a concern that, the more the number of stakeholders, just the more people you have in a decision process, sometimes it can take longer. Some would say the decisions are more durable, but there's an issue to consider there. Like I said, we don't think this is the full pro-con list, but it was just, these are to get conversations started. So if you go to the next slide. This one is just one of the things that we talked about specifically is that we should not underestimate the resource commitment to any of these changes. When people say, whether I'm a market participant or I'm a stakeholder and I want to be more involved in decisions, I want to be more involved in putting proposals forward, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work and it's going to take resources. And so we just need to be mindful of that and shifting from where we are today to a future is change. And so there will be some change aspects of that. The other thing that the GRC talked about is that we did have some lessons learned from the EDAM market design process, that the working groups seem to work well. The idea of having CAISO staff in a facilitative role rather than kind of putting the ideas forward seemed to work well. Was it perfect? No. And I think at times there was probably a desire for more stakeholder kind of ideas and concepts to be moved forward, but there was a lot that could be learned there that could be built on. So if we go to the next slide. Again, we love this slide. And all we've done is added an orange arrow to say what the GRC would like to throw out are some ideas, and we're going to talk about those ideas in a minute, of how to move from where we are today more towards this bottom left-hand box of still staying on this inclusive side, so really focused on the stakeholder side, but getting to more influence on the market design. And I think Commissioner Tani presented this earlier this week, and she recognized that there are lots of steps along this orange arrow, right? It's not just one thing that gets you to the bottom of the arrow. There are many steps that you could take along this arrow. And so we're going to throw out a couple to talk about, and really that we want to get feedback from this group about. So if you go to the next slide. So here are some concepts being considered, things we want to talk about. The first is kind of building on what seemed to be something that was working in EDAM market design, create a facilitation function for the ISO staff, similar to what they did for the working groups, with really building the expectation then that there is stakeholder-driven policy dialogue in those working groups, so that their role is facilitative and that it's really intended to build more stakeholder perspective and ideas. Second, transition the Regional Issues Forum to an advisory or policy review committee with a more formal advisory role to the boards. And so really, as Matt mentioned, we did remove any kind of constraints on the Regional Issues Forum from giving advisory kind of perspectives, but maybe transitioning it to say, no, we actually expect advisory opinions, and maybe it's on certain things. Also funnel the broader stakeholder process through this new advisory body. What we heard the last time we looked at this in the first governance review committee was some concern last time around when we were saying, should we do an advisory committee? Should we make the RIF an advisory committee? Comments came in pretty consistently to say, let's not create a super stakeholder group, right? Let's let the very open democratic stakeholder process that the CAISO has had in place for years works well for a lot of people. And we don't want to create a super stakeholder group where now you have to be in this, putting your own comments in and then, working within this group. And so is there a way, and this is what this bullet's trying to say, is can we put this broader stakeholder process in through the RIF process so that you're building on the really comprehensive kind of perspectives that are found in the stakeholder process? If we were to do something like that, should you reconsider the composition of the RIF? Do we have the sectors about right, or would it need something a little bit different? Do you need to refine the RIF charter and the operating guidelines? I talked about creating an expectation of an opinion, and should there be an advisory role on key corporate policies, such as the multi-year roadmap, which we have heard a lot about in the most recent round of comments, that there is a strong desire for stakeholder input on what issues get prioritized to be worked on. So if we go to the next slide, here are kind of some of we want kind of feedback on all of those ideas, but also some questions about how much detail do you want from the GRC in some of this? How much process detail versus would we just, kind of lay out what the expectations are and let you worry about operating guidelines and all of that? Really thinking about what would be the effect on non-EDAM stakeholder processes. So there are a lot of things that the ISO works on that are not EDAM specific, like transmission planning, like resource adequacy. Where's the role for this advisory committee in that? How much deference would you expect to see from the governing body and the ISO Board of Governors? So consistent with what Matt suggested, right? These presentations are given, they're given at the joint board meetings when there's a joint board meeting. So the ISO Board of Governors is also getting the benefit of the Regional Issues Forum report outs. And then how could an advisory committee best be structured for the best stakeholder representation? So that's the kind of framework. I think the next slide is just a schedule, which I'm going to tell you we reworked, so it's close. But we are going through May to kind of do this outreach, and then we probably won't have a straw proposal in June, but maybe in July. Just we want to really take the time to get this informal outreach and incorporate it in. So so that's what I have to seed. Good conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Therese. That was a really great and interesting overview of some of the efforts that the GRC is focused on. And it's clear that we as stakeholders have a very broad range of issues to discuss around governance in the coming months. So for today, we're hoping to start some of that dialogue around potential changes to the RIF. And to that end, we have a great panel representing a really broad range of stakeholder and market participant interests. What I thought would make sense in terms of process is just to tee up a few questions or topics for various members of the panel to consider. And just as a reminder, if we can go to the, thanks. We have Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, Don Aniscourt, who is representing Southern California Edison Company, Doug Marker from Bonneville Power, Josh Walter from Seattle City Light, and Vijay Satyal representing WRA here. And so I can kick things off, and whoever would like to weigh in, please feel free. But I wanted to talk first about some of what Matt discussed in terms of the current role of RIF under the existing authority that the RIF has, as it was recently modified by the Governance Review Committee process last year. Can you comment on whether there are things that the RIF should be doing differently today under the existing scope of authority?
I can go first, if that's okay.
Great.
It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, and thanks, Meg, for facilitating. So I wanted to provide some additional context, kind of leveraging what Matt provided. And I will make a pitch that if you have not read the charter or the operating guidelines for the RIF, please do so. There is a lot that we talk about, and I think it's incredibly important that we start with the governing documents that we have, that the GRC has worked so hard to set up over time. So one of the things I wanted to note is clarify that a lot of what I'm focused on as an IPP and marketer sector liaison is what the RIF does today and how can it be more effective under our current governing rules. And so we've taken a look back, and what I wanted to share with the group is that I'm talking about operating guidelines that were in place in 2016, well in advance of any kind of governance review. So I wanted to anchor us on that none of this is new. The RIF has 7 responsibilities that we are supposed to be maintaining. I think Matt touched on 1 or 2 of them, which I think of those responsibilities, 1, 2, and 7, we're doing a pretty good job of. We're supposed to be scheduling meetings, bringing forward informational updates, providing education, providing this venue for our sectors, and then also briefing the EIM governing body on those meetings and what occurs, which is number 7. 1 and 2 are essentially setting up these informational updates and then getting input from our sectors and on some of these issues, which I think we're doing those things as the RIF. 3, 4, 5, and 6, we are not currently doing. And I think it's really important that we talk about how do we meet our responsibilities and what kind of accountability. Teresa, I think that was helpful that you said that. I made a note. Because what's been on my mind is maybe we do need something to make us feel more accountable as liaisons and as a RIF community so that we start to meet these responsibilities and obligations that we have had since 2016. For some context, that includes an advisory role. It is an informal advisory role, but it's really, I want to emphasize that the RIF is in fact a stakeholder advisory body, and we are supposed to be advising the EIM governing body and CAISO leadership on some pretty specific topics. So one of these responsibilities that are in the current operating guidelines, we are supposed to be having a forum by which we, and Matt, you asked who are those people. Frankly, I thought we were, when we were elected by our sectors to be the liaisons, to speak to and advise the EIM governing body and the CAISO leadership on specific topics. I think number 3 is how do we provide some feedback on issues that are relevant to EIM and that we are potentially advancing to the EIM governing body and the CAISO for considering and establishing stakeholder processes. This body is supposed to be feeding up to that level of leadership based on sector input we've received, what specific issues need to be addressed in a policy stakeholder process. Another thing that we are supposed to be doing is identifying EIM issues that might benefit from some thought power and thought leadership. And so we're supposed to be setting up sub-teams of RIF members, not just liaisons, but any member of our sectors to focus on these issues. We could do that for governance. Like we could take this set of questions and we could set up a sub-team and work with members who are interested and provide that back to you. In fact, we're supposed to be doing that. Something else we're supposed to be doing is bringing, we are supposed to be briefing the EIM governing body on our views or opinions as our sectors on specific EIM issues. I assume we should be doing that on issues that we are prioritizing. I think that's one thing you're going to talk about, BJ, is how do we as a RIF kind of prioritize the issues to take back to our sector, to collect the input, our second responsibility, from our sectors, to bring that back as liaisons and express these views. So I just want to round out a little extra context of there are 4 responsibilities that have been in our operating guidelines for years, well in advance of any EDAM conversation, that we are supposed to meet. And I think that it is a really important question of what do we as a group need to make us accountable so that we start to meet those responsibilities. And one idea that I'd like some feedback on, if folks have any thoughts on it, is maybe we need a report card equivalent. Anna might think this is funny, but I'm thinking about this corporate scorecard. I know it's cheesy, but you have like specific things you know you have to do. They're SMART goals. They're not as high level as the things I was just talking about, but you can put a red, yellow, a green, and you know if you are falling behind, if you're on track, or if you're exceeding expectation, and that can help make groups more accountable. And that's something we can do before the GRC does anything. Because again, these are existing roles and responsibilities we have had for a very long time. We just need to figure out how we're going to start to meet them. So thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think, Doug, you want to jump in on this.
I do want to jump in. Thank you. Doug Marker with Bonneville Power Administration. And I have been involved within Bonneville since the early days of the governance, working internally on what Bonneville thinks are principles for market governance. And a couple of aspects of this. First of all, I want to acknowledge that the RIF is in an evolutionary process right now. It's just beginning, I think, to grow into the role that was recommended for it last year. And now we're talking about what should it be in a possible EDAM. So this is a very fast evolution, and I want to be aware of that. I want to recognize that. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, the advisory role I think is really important, and that the RIF should be bringing sector perspectives to both the governing board and the board of governors, when appropriate, with majority and minority opinions. It's okay to disagree, but to flesh out what are the ramifications of these issues. And in that respect, from a sector base, that might be different than the question of a market participants committee. In my mind, a market participants committee is a little bit more diffuse amongst the roles of market participants in the actual operations of the market, whereas the roles of the sectors are different. From a PMA perspective, we have a different perspective on some of these issues than perhaps a municipal utility, because we have federal statutory obligations. We have a very significant environmental responsibility that is core to what we do. So we have to be able to bring that forward as kind of distinct. I think that it's important to be able to speak to the boards directly, as has been suggested, inviting minority and majority opinions. The other thing I would say that I came prepared to say, because this has been part of what Bonneville has been thinking about in these designs, is to be anticipatory. It's a real achievement that the RIF is now able to be involved in pending stakeholder issues before the boards. And so it's just now, that's an illustration of what it's just now getting into. But I think the RIF should be looking ahead around the corner at the issues that are coming, and to be able to flag what should be attended to. And one way to do that is to be actively engaged in the ISO's policy roadmap process. So those are a couple of thoughts that I had.
Great. Thank you so much. Would anyone else on the panel like to weigh in?
Yeah.
Good day.
Thank you. So as my RIF colleagues know, on the liaison team, I'm on this panel not as a chair. I'm representing the public interest sector, and I've not been able to caucus with them to get specific reactions to this. So these are brainstorming thoughts. But I do want to comment from a PIO perspective, but also from a chair's perspective, what this means. There's two angles to this. So I kind of agree with Doug a lot in terms of recognizing that there is this newer state of authority being given or newer role for us through the joint authority framework, and I'm trying to appreciate what that means. But Kathleen has hit home the conversation pretty well. I'm not sure I would agree fully that items 3 through 6 are not being done at all, but I would agree that there is shades of gray on that, and there's definitely things we could be doing better. And I totally agree with you on that. There are a couple of things I'm like, wow, we should be doing this. So just so you know, I have been reading the operational guidelines for like 2 months now, a lot. So 2 things. One, I like this slide, by the way, Therese, that's really good. I think what is not clear to me on behalf of my sector, if I go and tell them, hey, there's a new value-added role for us being offered. Do you want it to be formal in terms of the formality of the input versus a more formal voice in terms of authority? Because the word formal can mean many things, number one. Number two, I've thought about this very hard, and I ran it by a couple of colleagues, and they didn't say, Vijay, you're crazy, is that I do think, to Doug's point, if you want to enhance our visibility and our role into actual policy changes, we offer a 2-part approach, the majority and minority, if the RIF is in consensus. But there may be times when the RIF liaisons are not in consensus. So then there be an effort to show what is the diversity of thought in the RIF, and therefore there be majority consensus versus minority. So the governing body gets to really see what they are choosing to go with and what they will choose to not accept or lose on the table. So those are my 2 big picture thoughts. And my one last comment I'll make is to the questions here raised. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask here. Is if the question is about should we have more voices on the table, I would like to flip that question back, Therese, in a way to the GRC, is what voices are you missing that you're not getting right now? I think that's my way of asking rather than answering your question. Thank you.
Can I just, not to turn the question back to you, but I think that's the question. I think that's the question we're asking you all is, do you feel like there's a voice that's missing? We tried to work very hard in the modified sectors to capture that, but maybe we didn't get it right.
So I'll say quick, then I know Don may want to speak, but I do want to say that I am hesitant to in any way, shape or form feel that this advisory body or committee would be market participant driven because of the very reasons you've identified well. There's a lot of benefits to PG&E, other EIM entities when public interest, consumer advocate, and others spend time of their own and reviewing proposals or giving feedback that adds color. But I do think that if there are voices not being heard, then there needs to be a better soul searching within the existing sector representations. Whom are we not hearing from and where we need to go? But I'll take that homework back to my sector and convey that. So thanks.
Josh? Sure.
Okay. Excuse me, maybe a couple quick comments. I do think that in terms of the current authority doing what we are tasked with doing well before additional augmentation occurs is something that I believe we should be doing. I think that shouldn't foreclose the idea of additional augmentation to governance. But in terms of the RIF specifically, I agree with Kathleen. I think that we really need to focus and think hard about how we achieve the charge that we are set out to do to begin with. So that's maybe agreement number 1. I think agreement number 2 with something that Doug brought up that flows both up and down in terms of how we plan and how we influence outcomes or the initiatives that CAISO ultimately takes up. I do think that there's a significant link between what we can do in bringing issues forward with the stakeholder roadmap process, but making sure that there is a feedback loop on the upside, feeding up to CAISO staff, CAISO executives on what's important to us from a sector by sector basis, but then also maybe a feeding across throughout the liaison sectors that make sure that we are maybe we can come to some level of agreement while also not biting off more than what we can chew. Because I think that's also a really important issue that we're continuously coming up against with the stakeholder roadmap, is that there's always way more than what we can included than we can actually achieve. So trying to instill a sense of reality into what are the most important elements that we have an influence and the ability to coalesce over. We all obviously don't need to agree on the outcomes, but we do need to agree that we need to instill a sense of reality of what can be achieved under certain time constraints and work towards fixing or addressing those issues.
Thanks. A couple of comments as well as concurrences. In terms of when I first started looking at these questions, I asked myself, a nod towards this morning's panel, what is the problem we're trying to solve for, and asking how the RIF should change or should the RIF change. So I think that that's a really good anchoring question for us to have. And, you know, when I heard Therese talking, I thought I pinpointed what the question was or what the problem was. But then I heard Kathleen speaking, and clearly she had a different perspective. So I came back to saying, okay, I think we kind of have to ask the question, what problem are we trying to solve for? And then the comment to that is, what's missing? This goes to the question of voices that are not being heard. What's missing, and can the RIF help fill that void? So I'm really focused on value add. What is the value add that RIF can bring to the process overall within a reasonable bounds? I'm very conscious of the resource issue. You know, I come from a large company and we are facing resources. So I just can't imagine smaller companies just, you know, having hundreds of hours to devote to all this. So those are some of the thoughts that are going through my mind. And I also really loved what you had to say, Kathleen, about we've got 7 responsibilities. Are we actually fulfilling all of them? I took a look at those 7 goals earlier today. I'm like, okay, well, are we checking all these boxes? So I completely agree with you that it makes sense to make sure we're doing well on all those boxes. Perhaps those boxes need to change, but first, you know, take a look and do some metrics around how we are doing. Maybe some of those boxes are not appropriate anymore, but I think it is important to figure out if we're meeting those goals and how do we try to meet those 7 goals. I think those were my observations with the questions that we've had so far.
Thank you so much. This is a great conversation. I'd like to pivot a little bit. We've talked throughout really the last couple of days about the CAISO stakeholder process. And I'd like everyone to share perspectives on how the RIF should interact with CAISO stakeholder processes. Do you view the RIF as a supplement to that process? We've heard it described as an educational forum. Is the RIF a separate forum, or something else entirely? Love to hear from the panelists on that.
So I'll go first on this one. I actually want to sort of build on what Don commented to address your question, Meg, as well. I want to take the latest EDAM work groups as an example versus 2 years back, the same EDAM effort pre-COVID, what we were going through. I think the enormity and the visibility of the EDAM this time was evident in the way I'm not just saying because CalISO staff is here and Anna is here. I'm saying it because what was done with the EDAM work groups and the way they had assigned staff was not just phenomenal, it was helpful, though it was a grueling marathon of 2.5 months, but it was the way to engage and take a lot of stakeholder engagement. So that's one thing I want to bring up. But second, to Don, I want to share something, and Kathleen, hopefully I can keep convincing you a bit, is this January, the first RIF meeting, we had a group, a workshop on greenhouse gas accounting and what the latest views are. That directly was influencing the EDAM CalISO staff, and I forget his name, the gentleman. He attended and helped him have that information and revisit the whole process for how that whole work group would run. So I'm not trying to say it's all perfect, but I do feel that if we can plan better and if we know what end state those processes are intended to get at, I think there's definitely a lot of flexibility, but I am not as deeply involved as many of you are in many other processes. Thanks.
Anyone else care to comment?
I will, unless Josh. No, I totally defer. Okay. Sorry. So Kathleen Colbert, competitive sector, to keep it simpler, less words, I think is such a great question. Context, for those who don't know me well, I've been a stakeholder in a couple different venues, PJM as well as here. So I have experience in both the committee structure and in the CAISO structure. So I have what I consider well-developed opinions and compare and contrast between the two. I think there are pros and cons to both. I want to be very, and so in my mind, the RIF, the way that I see it, is similar to something that exists in PJM's structure, which is why I gave that context. They call it a liaison committee. We call ourselves liaisons. So pretty close. There is a nuance to the rules, and I want to be fair to share it with you so you understand also why they do it the way they do it. But unlike in CAISO's world, we can talk to Board of Governors. We can talk to the EIM governing body members. That's something where we can have touch points. In other markets, there are rules that prohibit that. They're considered ex parte-like conversations. And so you are not able, as a market participant or a stakeholder, to engage directly with a board member. So what they set up is this liaison committee. So it does serve a slightly, so that's why I want to be fair and transparent. There's a difference. But what the liaison committee is essentially the same thing that the RIF is. It's sectors that are defined, and you elect and choose a whip, sector whips, sector reps, whatever you want to call them, liaisons. And their responsibility is pretty much the same as what we have in our existing guidelines. There's no formal opinion. There's no voting. There's nothing like that. The expectation is that you have sector meetings. They are closed sector meetings. You have an open and honest discourse with other and sector members that share similar perspectives, and you collect and understand what those perspectives are. The sector whip's responsibility at the liaison committee meeting is to go and round robin table each sector representatives, then provide a synthesis of what their sector's thoughts are. Here are specific pain points. Here are challenges we're having. Here are things that we'd really like to see. And they are agenda topic specific. So just a few of our favorites: EDAM, day-ahead market enhancements, maybe energy storage, because I like storage, would be 3 topics on the meeting, and each sector rep gives just a few comments about what their sector thinks. They're not, and I like what you said, Doug. I don't know if we can get to a place of a majority and minority opinions until we can get to a place where we can at least synthesize what our sectors think and share just broad thoughts, kind of walk before you run approach. But I understand we need to go somewhere further down the road, but a couple thoughts.
Kathleen, I have a quick follow-up for you with regard to the PJM process. Are the sectors comprised solely of market participants, or is there a voice in that process for other stakeholder interests too?
Yeah, it's a good question. And off the top of my head, the market participant versus stakeholder definition Therese you talked through is a little unique. So I don't want to misrepresent the crossover. But I will say that every ISO RTO that sets up their groups, their sectors, can define them as they choose. So one of the things that we've thought about, and I'm speaking for my company specifically, not my sector, is that we think that something that makes the West unique is that special interest parties, what I think is kind of like your stakeholder category, are really impactful and important to our stakeholder process. And if we were to have sectors, and we do, on the RIF, we have that sector. So I think it's something we already do. We recognize that that is an important voice, and we have those sector representatives, and their expectation is you're engaging with those stakeholder-like folks and bringing back that view. So I think that while some areas have interested parties, if you read the old independent governance policy statements out of FERC, there's a lot about what is fair representation, what's expected for fair representation, and this was a heavily contested point about who is considered a member of the ISO RTO. So they're all a little different. But I think what's important is each region can define the sectors that matter to them, and they have to support it that is
a fair representation of the interested parties within their region. And I think stakeholders are a big one here.
Thank you. Before we move on, does anyone else want to weigh in on how Josh comments on?
Sure, yeah. Back to the question of how RIF should interact with CAISO stakeholders, not to say we didn't answer that through that dialogue, but maybe a different perspective, right? So whether we believe it's true or not, many stakeholders believe that CAISO stakeholder processes are heavily driven by CAISO staff. So in terms of the way in which the RIF can help alleviate or at least minimize those concerns, I think that there's again, it could be something along the lines of we just need to do our charge better. But being the voice of the stakeholders in a particular stakeholder process, absent or outside of the bounds of operating in a stakeholder process in the traditional sense of, we listen to CAISO staff, they present their opinions, we go out, we comment, they come back to us with an additional, fifth round straw proposal. That has, I'd say, that is ripe for the RIF to step in and be a collective voice in a CAISO stakeholder process, right? So it being an opportunity where maybe some of those continued operations of processes continue to be led by CAISO staff. And I do think that the EDAM workshop exercise completely turns this example on its head, right? That is not a great example of where I'm coming from. But continuing to have a stakeholder driven stakeholder process, stakeholder, is I'd say ripe for the RIF to take up and truly kind of be the voice with a very light touch to or from CAISO staff in order to really be able to provide a voice that may be a bit unique.
Been doing that all day. Doug Marker again. Don asked, what is the objective or what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And one theme that is important, I think, through all this is building trust, and a process that is increasing the communication among the sectors is going to be to the benefit of the market, I think. So I think that the alternative to a sector-driven comment process is the kind of comment process that we're used to in many venues, where you just have a whole list of undifferentiated participants, and if it's a robust process, the decision document responds to those. It doesn't acknowledge that different parts of the footprint have different perspectives, and that those have been weighed, and that they're respected, and that the acknowledgement and the consideration of those perspectives helps build trust. I think that's something to keep in front as one of the objectives for this discussion.
So I'm hearing a really common theme, which is a desire for more stakeholder involvement, whatever form that takes, in the CAISO stakeholder process, which I view as sort of very democratic. It's open to all comers, and then the CAISO kind of weighs different perspectives in formulating the next iteration of its proposal. Yes. I'm wondering if we could comment maybe with a little bit more specificity around the concept of a market participants committee or a sector-driven stakeholder committee that might drive market design. That was one of the questions I think that the GRC is interested in feedback on, and I'm wondering if anyone has any preliminary thoughts to share.
Definitely, I think I'd like to speak on behalf of public interest organizations. I don't want to speak for consumer advocates, but I feel they may on this matter agree a little bit with me. The market participant-driven approach definitely, and Therese and the team and GRC's put this really well. So I'm leveraging the slides, by the way, to position my view. It definitely shows like there are certain members who are entitled to have a role in the market, have a price formation benefit, transact, skin in the game, and the others don't. So it kind of creates this kind of a disenfranchisement kind of environment, which we don't want. At the same time, these very please other member entities who have skin in the game have their own stakeholder processes that are actually very public and driven. So it's like you can create this perception of conflict, a consistency conflict. Is in your forums you have something very public, but here you want it to be. So I definitely feel a stakeholder-driven process is helpful, but I don't know where Josh was going with a light touch, but I do feel that I think we should have direct, explicit roles or avenues to give feedback back to GRC and GV. But now I borrow Kathleen's thoughts as if we could do what we're doing better, like develop sub-teams. We've talked about deep dives. We're going to touch upon that. That was your idea, Meg. If we do some of the things we can do smarter and effectively, we can achieve the stakeholder way approach of giving good impact, good feedback for market design. That's kind of what I learned.
Thanks, Vijay. Others?
I'll jump in for a second. So I think that this is a helpful way to start the conversation, because what actually jumped out at me as someone who's been involved and a member of an RTO that has this kind of structure. And I was an affiliate member, which is important, which means I wasn't a part of the members committee. I did not have a vote at the members committee. As an affiliate, you don't. You do have a vote at the lower committees. There's a diagram I can share. If anyone wants to be bored to death, I can explain it. There's also a 100-page manual on how the process works. So, oh yeah, it's awful. Yeah. So please don't. I don't take what I'm saying as that this is the gold-plated way to do anything. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff, right? But it is. I don't see them as different. It was very much so a stakeholder-driven process, even when you have a members committee. I would caution, though, the GRCs to think through this, and the reason I'm pointing how complicated, you start with subcommittees. On the subcommittee level, stakeholders, anyone participates. You can, and it's not the votes. There are not votes the same way there are the upper committees, and so you first do a stakeholder process. That gets vetted through the subcommittee level, that then gets raised to the mid-level, the lower committee. Affiliates can vote. Those are members only. There's a really important thing, though. That is an artifact of those policy statements and those processes I was mentioning. So the pools themselves, the way that they function is that the market participants that had a vested interest had an ownership in the pool. So when we talked about converting to RTOs, who is a member became very contentious at that time because of a transition from a pool structure into an RTO. In the ISO, we didn't have necessarily the same process, so we didn't have that type of debate, which is another reason we're differently situated, where interested parties should be considered a sector, right? It is a different framework than we're working with than like the power pools that converted based on having to respect their owners. Then one more thing. That's just the mid-level. Then it goes up to the upper committees and they can vote. It's really complicated because it has to ensure stakeholder input, a robust stakeholder process, and then the memberships that have a vested interest, who were those owners, get to vote. I think that there are some challenges with voting, and I think it's premature, just as a pitch, to talk about voting. In our processes, there's a lot we can do incrementally to make them more robust and to create this framework of a sector communication that provides added value without talking about formal opinions or voting.
So I'll take one thing on as the chair of RIF right now. Right away, one action item is we'll make sure that the summary of this presentation goes back to each of the liaisons. Please send it back to your sectors and communicate it. But to Teresa's point, what is the voices missing? Emailing your sectors and thinking other groups that you're hearing from that don't get a chance to present. So that's FY. But question back to you, Kathleen. By the way, I'm dealing with a lot of interesting experience with SPP on their membership definition, and there being absolutely no voice and access in some areas. But are you implying, if imaginary state of the world with the current sectors we have, could there be a new sector called ad hoc, undifferentiated public? I'm just trying to understand what would be a way to classify another set of voices that we don't know who they are, but they could fit in there and still have some representation.
I'm going to flip a question back to you, Vijay.
There seems to be a tennis match I'm getting a lot today.
How do you define the sector you represent?
I truly define the sector as one that is looking at public interest, benefits, and the consumer interests that are affected by policy or regulatory changes where they may not have a direct voice through Matt Lacar, who doesn't listen to his phones. But well, now he will.
I feel like I have to defend Matt.
I feel I can.
I'm Matt Lacar, and I represent the public interest. Can I join your sector? Can I be the liaison for your sector? What if my 10 friends all show up at your sector meeting and we all say, we're the public interest, Matt is the liaison?
Totally agree. But then you have to step off PG&E employeeship, right?
Why? There's no independence requirement for being a member of a sector. And by the way, PG&E, we have a foundation that gives millions of dollars to public interest causes. Like, we're in the public interest. Yeah. I'm being somewhat facetious, but like the question of standing when you have voting rules is critical. Like, who gets to vote? Who gets to vote for your liaison role within your sector? Nevertheless, in an ad hoc sector that has no definition of who can join and who can't.
Right. So going back to you, I think I tried to answer your question on what public.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate Matt's input on it.
No, I do too.
And I think that it's what I'm trying to emphasize. Voting is a very slippery slope. It's something that so the manual that I'm thinking of is 110 pages. A lot of it is dedicated to voting. That's a lot of extra effort that the CAISO will have to support in maintaining voting rules. I mean, there's a lot really quickly. And so I understand what you're saying, Matt, but I really think we should not focus so much on the stuff that is really not necessarily even on the table, right? So
I agree.
To Dawn's point, I don't like the question, what's the problem we're trying to solve? I think the problem that we're trying to solve is that some stakeholders, really, it's easy to engage in the CAISO's processes. They have the resources, they have the skill set, the know-how, right? And so they do. There are other types of stakeholders, whether they fit either category, if that's okay, who don't have the resources. They could be a company that is a trader that participates and bids in to EIM, but that trader is not on the regulatory team and wants to participate in sector calls. That's fabulous, in my opinion. I want them to participate in our sector call. I want to hear their input. It's a forum of giving access to members of a sector to join and, have us provide informational updates, give them information, give them education, make this more accessible and digestible of a confusing process, but then also to bring that back. And here's what I think we're not doing well. Doing some kind of well.
We can do better.
We can do better. Is the feedback loop of bringing that back up to whomever we need to. Is it the governing body? Is it the GRC? Is it the BOG? Is it CAISO leaders? Maybe we need some clarity on exactly who.
Yeah, and we've started that conversation today already this morning.
I agree.
Met with Rob Kanzioka and some others, and we've agreed on a plan on how to start giving regular good updates and summary updates as well. So I'm on that. Pass noted.
All right. Dawn, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of comments on things that have happened in the last 10 minutes or so. Timing-wise, we've talked about access to the boards, and I support that, but I want to throw this in there, the mix. If you want your voice to have weight before the board, you need to be getting to the board before they're voting on something. So that means a lot of homework and work done well in advance so that your voice is not showing up for the first time in front of the board the day that they're voting. Because realistically, I don't think that's not gonna make a difference. I just wanted to throw that timing in, which again goes to resources. I think it's possible, but it really means people doing homework well in advance and staying maybe even ahead of staff proposals. I think there's tremendous value to the education element, just because of the point that Kathleen raised. These are complicated issues, and no one person really has the time to delve into all of these. So, and most of us don't even have the time to delve into any of these. So I think having someone step up to actually say, okay, I'm going to really undertake explaining the RUC to people so they understand how to, that's a lot of work, but I think that adds a lot of value if you have a really substantive PowerPoint that people can share and refer back to and create a loose leaf notebook. I really actually think that adds a lot of value. And so again, going towards value add, I think you can really serve stakeholders well that way by providing that much needed education. I also just want to comment, if you are going to evolve, try to be maybe a little flexible instead of you must, more of a you may, and then trying to check that box and make sure you're holding yourselves accountable for that. I think those were sort of my general comments on process. Oh, one last question. I think folks are very concerned about perspectives not being heard, silent voices, perspectives not being acted on. And I think we have to ask ourselves that no matter what the governing structure is and who wins in the end, what are the indicia that we need to see that demonstrates that whoever the decision-making body is actually listening to and processing the comments? Because we know not everyone's position is going to end up in the final solution, but you can manage people's expectations by certain acknowledgments along the way. But I think people need to talk about what those acknowledgments look like so that they can say, all right, well, they actually did mention this and they gave us a reason why. What do you need those decision makers to, or the pre-decision makers to acknowledge so that you feel like your comments were heard and evaluated and understood, and then perhaps they went another way or not. But I think understanding that to manage expectations is important. Thank you.
I think this is a good opportunity to open this discussion up to others in the room. If there are comments or questions that non-panelists would like to weigh in on, I think now would be a great time to turn to that.
I want to weigh in.
Your panelist did.
So I've been thinking about this question of what problem, we want to try and solve, or at least what problem we want to solve next, maybe, assuming that we live up to our existing authority. And something stuck with me that I think it was Josh mentioned, which is the perception that CAISO staff have a lot of influence on how issues are presented to the board for decision, and in particular, how stakeholder comments are summarized for the board. So I have a modest proposal, which I think actually would be a really good role for the RIF, which is typically at the final draft proposal stage when the board presentation or governing body presentation is made, CAISO staff has a slide where they summarize stakeholder comments. And it's written by CAISO staff, and it's very reductionist. Very few, of us recognize our comments in the bullet points up there. And I think it would be a great service to the stakeholder community if the RIF were in fact tasked, or the chair of the RIF or representative was tasked with putting together the slide and perhaps presenting it to the decisional body that just said, here's what this sector had to say, here's what this sector had to say. Again, it's burden, but at least it's not writing a whole separate set of comments, which I think is a higher bar. It's putting together one slide that summarizes comments that have already been submitted or shared with the RIF by the sectors that already exist. So I think that might be a nice kind of next evolutionary step, but I'm curious what feedback people have. And it does solve, I think there is a real and credible perception that, there is a problem to be solved.
I'd like to follow up on that. I think that's a really interesting and good idea, and it's certainly one that should be further considered. However, I know that in CAISO stakeholder processes, there are typically multiple iterations of proposals, and there's a constant sort of I think the CAISO staff is constantly in the position with with each proposal of having to kind of weigh different stakeholder comments, evaluate them, and determine how to address them in the subsequent version of the proposal. So I just wonder about that evaluative process that's in the middle of a stakeholder initiative, and kind of whether you see the role of the RIF in filtering stakeholder views as sort of something that should happen at the end, or is it something that, there may be value in having that be ongoing? Because I think, as the CAISO is evaluating stakeholder positions, that's turning up potentially in the next version of whatever the proposal is. I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. So I hadn't thought about, it is iterative, and stakeholder input is, listened to, acted upon, incorporated during that process. I come back, Dawn kind of put it as like, our obligation as the RIF is to make sure that that there is an avenue for all voices to be heard, right? And I think the frustration you sometimes hear is the stakeholder that's put their effort in, put comments in, and they don't see those comments in any way reflected or even presented as having been rejected, right? There's just like they've disappeared into the void. And I think having an opportunity as a stakeholder, as the bearer of the stakeholder torch in the formal decisional process to say, here are some other ideas that were raised by a specific sector or specific stakeholder that you're not seeing before you, governing body, right? Or you're not seeing before you, board.
So, yeah, so I think I just want to do a quick response. I'm sure we can go to this, but in a way, I'm now grateful for Kathleen's reminder at the beginning. We should be doing some things we already expect to be doing. So what you just said matches with the second last bullet on the screen, Matt. Create expectation of opinions or reports on key issues. But I have to agree with Meg in the sense that a currently trending stakeholder proposal can go through 4 versions, 9 versions, and unless you are on the RIF and tracking that, you may not be the most ideal person to write the summary. So it doesn't matter whether it's the chair or Kathleen or Ian or somebody. The point of the matter is, I think RIF should, this is my opinion from the PRO sector, if possible, when issues are coming up in front of GRC or GB, like Don's idea, before things are coming up for a critical point, RIF should try giving a summary opinion or view that can reflect minority and majority consensus. But I don't want to get locked into RIF having a hammer role in opining on CalISO stuff in case we have not been able to track that issue for the various reasons that some of you identified. So many things going on.
Yeah, here's my concern. There's at any given time, 15 to 30 different initiatives going somewhere, including both recurring initiatives and hot button stakeholder new initiatives. Some of them are balancing area issues that go to the CAISO board exclusively. Some of them are joint authority issues. Some of them are EIM advisory and, that get presented to the governing body. It's a very confusing landscape. I don't know when you say the RIF should do something, who you envision doing it. So we have a group of liaisons that represent specific sectors. Many of us track our subset of those 15 to 30 initiatives. I happen to work for a big stakeholder that has a lot of resources, and we probably track, between 25 and 30 of the 30, but it's still not everything. And I personally couldn't tell you, what comments from PG&E were made in all of them. I think, the pain point, and this is just, it's a brainstorming idea, right? So my sense is that the pain point for stakeholders is when they've made the effort to put something in comments, they've defended it at a stakeholder meeting, they've talked about it on multiple iterations, and they see nothing in the final product that reflects their input. It's not just that their view is, rejected for being impractical, or, the CAISO staff had a strong reasoned defense of a different proposal, but it just disappeared into the ether. And I think having the opportunity to, maybe they pursue it with their sector liaison. So somebody from my sector comes to me and says, I'm really frustrated that, I've seen the draft final proposal and my idea isn't even mentioned, right? That's something I would like the board to know about, or the governing body.
Okay, here goes. To get to Dawn's question about what's missing, at least in my mind, and I think, Doug, you and Josh hit on it, it's really oversight of the roadmap. There's just none. And I think this group could help with that process by defining priorities and feeding it in. But to get to Teresa's question a little bit, we need oversight, and I think we've got to get approval of the roadmap from the governing body, possibly the board, on certain issues. For example, we have a problem. We do not know the rules for how to procure from the Northwest for the summer of 2024. They don't exist. The ISO has not come out with their straw proposal yet on what it's going to be. It was supposed to come out a few months ago. Now it's been delayed. We have no deadline for when that filing is going to be made. We have no ability to check and see where it's going. It's gotten to the point now where FERC has required a quarterly report on it. That should not have to happen. We should know where it's going on something as critical as that. And I think what you're seeing in some of the other folks who come forward and trying to suggest more stakeholder control of the process is to have some idea of what the priorities are and what they're going to be done and the timing behind it. There's no reporting against a goal as to when things are going to be done. Things get reprioritized, things get into, processes get split into different phases without any, review of where they were against an original plan. I think that would be helpful for this group to be in that, more than just one, put in comments, have a meeting, come up with a slide and call it a plan. It's got to be more comprehensive. There is so much at stake with these different initiatives, so much planning on the part of market participants that go into it. These are, we do this on the transmission planning side. The board approves that plan. If there's a change to it because something comes up, it goes back to the board and they can revise it. There will always be times where the ISO needs the ability on an emergency basis to change it and come forward. But I still feel that Rob and John are pretty reasonable people. If that's the case, they'll approve the change. We need to get some idea of what this process is.
I don't know what the teeth would be here, but I see opportunity for a corporate scorecard for the stakeholder roadmap that may have an end result of some level of I don't know what the consequence of the teeth, like I say, but I do think that there could be some opportunity for a report out on how well the objectives of the roadmap have been achieved.
I think if I may, I'm not cutting anyone in line, am I? Okay. A couple of things maybe we could look at doing better to improve the status quo today is, taking more seriously our advisory role and feeding back into existing processes, not only with policy development, but also, as Dave suggested, with where the heck we're going. What should be the CAISO policy staff's prioritization? Feed that into the EIM governing body for those issues that directly affect EIM entities and the footprint. I think, on the other hand, to get to Don's point about and Teresa's point about where we'd like to go, I think the spirit of CREPC, one of the things I kept hearing was we have to keep doing the work to trust each other more. And to do that, we have to collaborate better and have inclusive processes. I think this is just my unfiltered thoughts as of now, not, I haven't spoken with my sector about it, but I think the existing CAISO stakeholder process is broadly very inclusive and does have those entities, environmental NGOs, market participants, et cetera, can feed into the process. I think in the spirit of increasing collaboration, though, I think there has to be more handoff, if you will, to the direct policy sausage making happening at the stakeholder level and the market participant level to sort of feed more of where we want to get to go. And I think the beauty of that approach, again, to Dave's point, is entities, market participants, and/or stakeholders who are really interested in a particular topic can lean in on that issue, and maybe they follow one policy development more closely to prioritize their time on what's important to them. And I think that also may help kind of parse out some of the resourcing issues that the CAISO and all of us, frankly, struggle with. Is if we could share in that responsibility a little bit more. Just an idea.
I think that's a great place to close out this conversation. Obviously, this is just the start of what I think everyone hopes will be a really robust dialogue around governance changes and the role of the RIF moving forward. I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for sharing their views today. I think we'll take a 10-minute break.
Yeah, we'll take a 10-minute break, a little tight, but thank you, Meg, for helping run the show with Matt, your initial help setting the stage. Therese, I think we have an understanding you'll be coming back to us, but I hope you got some ideas today. Great, thank you. Thank you all, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. And there is a comment online, but we'll get back on that. Thanks. Oh, yes. Hey, everybody, let's get going again. For those in the room, we're going to start the meeting again as we have a large number of folks online ready to hear and participate. And I do have a request to make. Of all of us. I've been guilty of this as well. We forget to introduce ourselves when we speak. So every time you are making a comment or you're responding to, please, I hate to say, but introduce yourself with the affiliation to the organization you're with. Folks online sometimes don't know when Vijay is responding to Matt and when suddenly Kathleen may chime in. So we all need to just be a little more mindful of introducing ourselves, if you don't mind, please. So clearly you've heard about the policy roadmap a few times, part of how we will engage, what we should be contributing to. So no better a segue than that Kathleen, one of the RIF sector liaisons, had proposed a desire for a conversation around the roadmap. So I'm going to give it to Kathleen to set the stage and where you wish for CalISO staff to comment. Thanks.
Sure, thank you, Vijay. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Again, I am one of the competitive sector whips with my colleague Ian White. It is my pleasure to introduce Anna McKenna, Vice President of the CAISO, of Market Policy and Performance, I think is the department title. Excellent. I'm really appreciate, Anna, you being willing to be here and to present on the policy roadmap process for the Regional Issues Forum community. What I intend to do is just give a brief overview of Anna, and feel free to fill in, Anna, if there's anything else you want to share, and then lay a little context for why we wanted this agenda item at this meeting. So Anna has, the CAISO and our stakeholder community are really privileged to have you in the role that you're in. You have so much experience. I think you've been since like 2005 or maybe longer working in the energy industry as a regulatory attorney. When I was at the CAISO in the policy group, Anna, for those who don't know, convinced me to come to the CAISO. You're welcome. And we worked very closely from the policy side and the legal side. And I think that you're a fantastic person to be in the position you're in over the group that you're managing. And a part of what you do is create that policy roadmap that Dave Rubin mentioned and Therese mentioned as a key corporate task that sets up the process. And I'll leave it to you to explain it. The reason that we wanted to have this agenda item at this RIF meeting is we thought this was the best quarterly meeting to set up kind of an education on what this is in advance of the upcoming process that should be getting up and running pretty soon. And so we wanted to give the RIF community a chance to kind of hear some important topics from Anna, touch points she'd like you to know about it, and then feel free to ask questions. So once, Anna, you're done, we'll just open it up for questions. But if there's anything, I'll hand it to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was a really nice introduction. Thank you. And it's always nice to be at the same table with you. So glad to be here. And thank you, everybody, for asking me to be with you here today. I have to say, when I said yes to this, I thought I was just going to go through the roadmap. What are we doing this year? Nice conversation. I had no idea what was going to precede my discussion. So I have to say it's going to take a slightly different turn than what I expected to do. But I'm happy to actually be here right after the discussion we all just had, because I do think, and just to share with you all, I've been at this role for about a year now. I was in it on an interim basis, before that for 6 months, but really officially only just a year. In fact, I think I'm celebrating my anniversary today or yesterday. I don't know exactly when, but I haven't been here a long time in this new role. I have been at the ISO for a long time, and I've seen a lot of changes both through the stakeholder process, the stakeholder community, the governance process. I've had the opportunity to work both with the Board of Governors over the years as well as the governing body, and I've learned a lot. Particularly over the past year, as our markets and our processes and the interest has expanded on the footprint throughout the West, and I really am I'm not quite done listening just yet. It's been a year, but I'm very much still in a listening mode as to how do we evolve the policy process in a way that provides really a feeling of comfort to the stakeholders that we're listening, we're incorporating, we're including, not just ideas, but actual proposals through the process. And so the discussion that was just had was actually very timely from my perspective. And, I really appreciate all the comments. And I do not envy this group's task, because you do have a very difficult, question before you as to how do you evolve in your involvement through the process. So before I even get started on what I was planning on talking about, I just want to say my door is open. It doesn't even lock, actually. So, it's easy to get in touch with me. It's, amckenna@kaiso.com. I'm always open for ideas from anybody about it. And, I will share my opinion for sure. As you guys who know me well, I do share my opinion willingly. David knows this well too well. But I will definitely also listen and evolve, hopefully. And I am very excited that I actually have this opportunity to make a bit of a different process. Before I dive into what I was going to talk about, I thought I'd take a couple of minutes at least share with you all some of the things I've done with the policy group and the analytics group and the group that I work with to actually move the pendulum a little bit more towards a more open process in the policy development process. So I reorganized the group last year so that I created a more sort of what we call a horizontal rather than vertical structure. And part of the horizontal approach I've taken in the policy development process is to I incorporated sector leads who are specifically responsible for reaching out to you all as policy is being developed to make sure that not only that we're getting the comments in paper and reflecting them on one slide that doesn't mean anything to Matt, but that we're actually making sure that we document and incorporate that stuff. It's a newer process. The structure has been in place, like I said, not that long, but I'm hoping that with the way we've restructured the policy development process within the group, that it will do so. I also assigned to a particular group, a segment of the group, the explicit responsibility of making sure that we track and respond to stakeholder comments and we document that and that it does get reflected in our documents. If nothing else, to signal to the board or the governing body and the memos that, this is what we did in response to stakeholder input. It is a challenge to sometimes synthesize all the input and get everybody's opinion. And I especially don't listen to David because David and I go a long way. But, but it is a challenge sometimes to make sure that we reflect all those things. And so I'm going to keep trying to make that better. So please don't feel like my presence in the room earlier today was in any way, I really appreciated that conversation. But I want you guys to know that I'm really trying really hard to create a process that allows us to provide a valuable product in a policy perspective, but also incorporate as much as we can. We're not done. I'm going to keep doing, trying on that, but I wanted to share that with you. The other thing that we are hopefully you're going to see this physically soon, is we're going to try to actually and we do this sometimes, is where we'll actually have a matrix of comments with responses to stakeholders and hopefully at least have a roadmap where you could see, oh, that's what they did with my comments. And if we put it in the drawer and they didn't respond to it, you'll know. So we're going to try to do a better job at documenting that, working with the external affairs folks. So I just want to share those two things that goes back to some of the stuff that you guys were talking about earlier, and hopefully that will help. So with that, I guess I'll go through the roadmap process, which is what Kathleen asked me to talk about. If we can go back to the prior slide, sorry about that, talk a lot. So the roadmap process is an annual process, and each year we go through a process where we collect information on what we should focus on. And I want to just point out there's two ways that we do that, and there's two kind of slightly separate but related processes. We have a catalog of items of stakeholder initiatives or stakeholder requested initiatives, some of which actually we input into the catalog as well, because FERC sometimes asks us to do things, or we view market issues that need to be addressed, and so we put those in the catalog. We maintain the catalog, and we do so on an annual basis, but we also create, as you all have been referring to, what we call the policy roadmap each year. And it's a cycle that goes throughout the year. We collect information at the beginning of the year on the catalog. Then we start a process through which we collect information on what we should focus on for the next year. The policy roadmap covers what we're going to do next year as well as 3 years ahead. We try to give a glimpse into that so that you can all as well prepare. We have a process through which we collect comments, and I heard a lot just previously that perhaps there needs to be adjustments there, but the process that's currently underway, we actually take stakeholder input on the proposed roadmap. We do put that together through slides, and we do so through slides because we leverage the content of the catalog that describes each one and where each item falls in terms of discretionary and non-discretionary. So the roadmap process itself really tries to leverage that and then says, here's what we're hearing, and we'll put a draft out of that to stakeholders. The cycle, the wheel you see on the slide will show that in July, we'll start getting comments on that roadmap process for next year, which of course implicates the years to come. So it's a annual process, does revolve some input from stakeholders, as I noted. How do we incorporate that input? We can go to the next slide, please. Well, we look at several factors, and we do actually seriously consider the input. I know sometimes it may not be always reflective, but we actually do consider the input very carefully. We sometimes do some outreach as well offline, and I'm sure many of you have been consulted by ISO staff about, hey, what did you mean about this? Wasn't quite sure. Or, what are the push and pulls and priorities that your company's looking for? So we do some outreach as well. But we also have an open stakeholder process where, we actually discuss the prioritization. And I just wanted to share with you all some of the criteria we'll look at for that prioritization. We don't have a strictly defined formula for prioritization that, where we throw things in and then it spews out for us what's going to happen. It's a little bit of an art, not just a science, but it's a process we go through where we do throughout the company and with stakeholders try to look at the factors that are important for the upcoming years. So for example, we'll look at, whether the stakeholder or proposed initiative would add reliability benefits, but, or it would also enhance the market efficiency. How broad is that efficiency? Is it specific, for example, is it just one party who wants it, or are we hearing this from many parties? Are we looking at, market enhancements that perhaps are nice to have, but could take a lot of work and involvement from folks and probably not provide a lot of value? So we look at those things, We also look at how important it is in terms of sequencing. And just as an example, we had the EDAM effort. We looked at that 2 years ago. We had put it as a prioritization. We didn't do anything on the EDAM effort for about 2 years. And then we heard a lot about, hey, this is really important to the stakeholder community. And, we want to get started on that again. So we put it back on that roadmap last year and we said, we're going to do this next year. And we provided that roadmap and visibility as to how the EDAM would evolve over the year. And there's been, that's fresh on all our minds. But there's many examples, where we do sometimes have to reprioritize and think about what exactly it is stakeholders want to have in that. And of course, there's always those regulatory requirements, non-discretionary items, as for example, and I'll touch on this later on a little bit, the transmission planning NOPR that just came out, that's going to put a little bit extra work on our plates and all of our plates. And so we are looking at sequencing and workload and how that factors into the roadmap for next year. Next slide, please. So what are the primary drivers? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think you all can, I think you appreciate these drivers. You're all very well familiar with what's going on in the industry, but the 2022 roadmap, if you wish, was, I think, driven by these three factors. And I would say these three factors have been driving our market policy evolution for the past 3 years, really. But, of course, the increased variability in load and resources is a primary concern. And that's, you can see that driving both the day-ahead enhancements as well as the EDAM enhancements and even some of the resource efficiency evaluation efforts we're currently engaged in. Increased amounts of storage on the system. I think, that's no secret. We are spending some time this year to make sure that our markets and our systems and our operations are well aligned to operate with the additional storage resources that do offer both benefits, but of course a different way of operating. And of course, economic and reliability benefits of the greater integration of Western markets. These are the three factors that we've been looking at now for some time that really were behind the 2022 roadmap. So with that, I was going to just maybe pause for a moment, and before I dive into some of the highlights of what our roadmap looks like for 2022, maybe ask if there's any questions or, any further comments about this process. I know you're all thinking about this very carefully, so be happy to answer any questions about the roadmap process.
Does anybody have any questions or comments, or anybody on the phone? Online, I mean? Please, you want to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, this is Polly Savage with Portland General Electric. As a EIM participant, my question for you is, in the process, what is the process to delay or suspend stakeholder initiatives?
I don't think we have a formal process to delay or suspend, but I will say what happens often is just based on stakeholder input. So we'll start an initiative and we'll start looking at certain elements. Things get a little bit more complicated than we thought. We often, we don't, and this is one area, just listen to you guys earlier, I don't know that we have a good, process for delivering that information, that might have changed. I think that's something I want to take back with my group and look at a little bit more carefully. It's like, how do we actually let people know this stuff is going on? I've heard about that now for some time, and it's something I think that is an enhancement we can make to our process, because I think that does, there are many factors that go into that decision. I wouldn't say, I think, David was suggesting maybe there should be some kind of voting process or something, not voting, but some kind of governance process around that, before a change is made. We don't currently have that. It's usually based on what we're hearing from stakeholder input or constraints around those initiatives, or somebody throws a wrench in and says, hey, you really have to get this done by the end of the year, like FERC, or, other challenges. Sometimes we have market design issues that we've had to deal with. I know many of you are familiar, over the years, there was a time when we had to stop everything and we had to work on bid cost recovery. I think everybody enjoyed that, for those of you who were in the market at the time. But yeah, we had to stop everything and do that because that was a big market design issue that we encountered. So there are times we have to reposition ourselves. I think what I'm hearing is, there's probably a better way of communicating both why we do that and when that's going to happen. We currently don't have, a process through which either the governing body or the Board of Governors actually vote on the roadmap. And that, I think, is, you see that in our process. We inform the board, we have informational briefings to both the governing body and the Board of Governors on the roadmap. They don't actually vote on the roadmap per se. So, that's just part of our current structure. I see pros and cons in both ways, in both directions. I will say some of the pros with the way we've been managing the roadmap has been that we've had the ability to be a little bit more, agile and reacting to issues over time. And I wouldn't want to take that away. So whatever structure you impose on a process such as this one, you have to take that into consideration. There's always going to have to be some off-ramps or some way of dealing with those issues that are unexpected. But yes, and maybe I've answered more than you wanted, but that's the answer to that question I can think of.
BJ, is there anyone on the phone that had a question? No, I was just going to check.
No one on the phone. Please, Matt.
Matt.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the prioritization is a bit more art than science. There's issues that crop up that are important but not necessarily urgent. So you mentioned EDAM was big and daunting, and we had other things to deal with, frankly, in California after summer 2020 that kicked the can down the road a little bit, and then you came back to it. But there's other issues that come up that are less important but have an urgency to them when there's bugs to fix, for example. So I'm recalling that in the initial stages of EIM implementation, there were a lot of that second category, a lot of things that were relatively minor fixes, but we prioritized them because we wanted EIM to work smoothly, right? And it was new, and we recognized that, sometimes when things are new, they have some kinks to work out. I fully expect when we get to EDAM, if there is an EDAM implementation, that it's going to require enhancements, fixes, those will consume a lot of time and bandwidth, whether or not they're big, important issues, and they're going to hit at the same time that all this backlog of stuff that we haven't been able to get to during the big EDAM build, has been piling up. So I'm curious, like, do you have a resource plan for that? How do you prioritize as between important and urgent activities?
Well, I would respond, and there's a slide in this deck we'll look at in a short while. Maybe we could just go to the last two slides, and I won't spend too much time on each individual initiative that we are currently focused on. But, when we looked at integrating EDAM over the next year, and we looked at some of the important issues, and I do agree we took some time to clean up some stuff we felt we had to do after the August events. We looked at stuff that we already were, we actually leveraged that we were already looking at some market design elements, and they fit nicely with EDAM. I don't feel like we had to actually move, too much off the plate to integrate EDAM. We did have to accelerate some of the stuff that we had been talking about doing, such as day-ahead market enhancements and resource sufficiency evaluation changes that we were, already sort of contemplating out there. We accelerated those. We also knew that we had to look at transmission reservations because David, that's, he told me I have to do that. Sorry, David, I get to. Yeah. But we didn't actually, it fit in within the priorities of the market, and I will say that it did so because we are all looking at the same drivers. The drivers I reflected in that slide earlier. I think the whole West is looking at that. We're all looking at those issues, and it's sort of whether or not you have an EDAM, you're going to have to address some of those questions because we still trade with each other on an extensive amount. So we still have that interdependency in the market, both in the bilateral markets as well as the market that that we operate. So I would say that there wasn't too much damage in terms of reintegrating EDAM into the prioritization. It did require some refocusing. But if you look at our roadmap, I think, we do provide a 3-year look ahead. There was some stuff we pushed off a little bit, like the hybrid resource evaluation, a deeper dive into some of that. Keeping in mind that we actually made a lot of improvements to the hybrid model, over the prior years, and we're actually still implementing some improvements later this year that we think will be helpful. So there really wasn't too much that was left on the cutting floor, if you wish. But that said, I think, there were some minor things, perhaps. I know there's ancillary services enhancements that some folks wanted that didn't seem to rise to the level of a common interest across the stakeholder community. We might have to go back and look at that. But if you look at the 3-year map for the items, a lot of the stuff that you saw previously, I would say were delayed about 6 months to a year, and then it just starts to resume again after that. So that's kind of the visibility I could give you as to where things are going after we do this complete 2022 initiatives, both on the EDAM, transmission reservation, as well as the energy storage enhancements, which, and the price formation, which all feeds, I believe, into a day-ahead market platform that will hopefully lend itself better for EDAM as well.
Try a question and see how fair it is. One of the lines that's been up on this chart for a number of years is the day-ahead market enhancements, which is really a fundamental component of EDAM. And I guess the question would be, when do you see the ISO putting a filing in at FERC to get certainty on what that enhancement will be and what the imbalanced reserve product may or may not be?
Well, we just had our stakeholder meeting last Friday, and I don't know if all of you got to participate, but it was a good discussion. We're targeting I think it's September board meeting, and so normally we file shortly, depending on the initiative, but we file soon after that. So we're hoping to get the filing in before the end of this year. That's our current trajectory, which gives us time to then, also wrap things up for EDAM as well as other elements around that. Price formation is on a slightly different trajectory. We're about to initiate that in the next week or so. You're going to see an issue paper coming up. We're looking at having some work group type structure around that as well for discussions. So that's just going to be kicking off shortly, and I am sure is going to be a very intense conversation as well. But as you can see from the chart, that's going to probably go through the end of the year. A little bit more discussion needs to happen in that area. And of course, price formation will include a discussion on the not just scarcity pricing, which was one of the big items, but now we're looking as well as incorporating into all our market elements a form of fast start pricing. Not quite sure what it's going to look like yet, but we're looking at that. And most recently, if you've read the EDAM proposal from top to bottom, which I know you all have, you'll see that we're looking to also consider market power mitigation in the context of EDAM in the price formation. That was some feedback we got, and we're looking for some feedback back from stakeholder community to see how that works. So that's sort of the integration of those rules. Again, probably more than you wanted from my answer, but I wanted to give you some visibility as to how those, initiatives fit in with each other and the timing of that.
This is Eric Eisenman with PG&E. I have a couple thoughts. I suspect that the folks in the room, I probably follow this topic more than anyone else. So it's come up, should the board and or governing body approve? I know they give you feedback, you give briefings to both bodies, completely appropriate. I think I cringe at the thought of them having to approve it. I think the board and the governing body have to give management some discretion. I don't think they need to micromanage which of these they're doing exactly when. Input, yes, but determine no. And then, of course, what happens if the priorities of the governing body and the board aren't the same? That you could get different votes. But I could be convinced otherwise. I'm interested in other input, but if I had to decide right now, my vote would be briefings, management discretion, like you're doing it now. Stuff comes up. Something could be approved today, and next week something come up. You immediately got to do an initiative on it. So I say give management discretion. Second, as a participating transmission owner in the balancing authority, there are certain initiatives that are going to be incredibly important to the balancing authority that will be less important or not at all important or not at all relevant to the EIM and other states. And those initiatives, those topics need to be given that kind of priority. That to me, the balancing authority is still kind of number one. For example, we know the California PUC right now is doing a lot of work on RA. At some point, you're going to have to do something probably to implement some of that, and it's going to get thrown into here, and something else might have to be sacrificed. Another example, I think we all know, and we've heard it earlier in the week, that FERC issued this NOPR on transmission planning. There's going to be a final rule at some point. I'd bet a buck you're going to have some kind of compliance filing. You'll want input from stakeholders. It'll have to go up on this table. Something else will have to be sacrificed. So, and the same thing with interconnections. I think there's actually an interconnection enhancements.
Yes.
Interconnection process enhancements decision item on the board's agenda only next week. It's part of the whole queue management. To me, that's I can't even see that without my glasses on, but that's probably more important to me and to our company and to the balancing authority in the shorter term than anything else that's up.
Yeah, and I think that those are all fair points, Eric. And on the decision on the roadmap, I can live with anything, but there are pros and cons to everything, as you say. And I can certainly appreciate your version of your concerns on the fluidity of that process and management's discretion. We did, and this presentation is getting a lot more informal than I had planned on. I was going to go through all that stuff, and I was going to mention the transmission planning stuff. I'd focused this presentation a little bit more on what I thought was, RIF specific, but absolutely, we've had to make some tough calls on IPE. We were not planning on doing interconnection enhancements, process enhancements, deep dive, but because of the issues at hand with the queue and handling those issues, that we had to take that on, and it did create some additional work. We also had to take on some additional work, and we will be taking on some additional work on the transmission plan, as you said, because of the NOPR. And also because there are areas within transmission planning that we ourselves were thinking, there's 3 areas that, we're thinking, that we might have to do some work on. And certainly the NOPR does help us focus that in as well. But I think, to your point as to, there are things that fall strictly under the balancing authority area. It is important to keep in mind that some of those things actually affect the regional markets as well, right? I would say the transmission planning does. I would say even interconnection does. The transmission, I would say the stakeholder community at large in the West. So I think those are all important initiatives that ultimately affect even how things happen in the markets. So I appreciate your comments that they affect the BAA, but there's certainly a perspective that, we all have to take, that strengthening all elements of the policy, be it transmission, markets, interconnection, ancillary services, does provide ultimately a better platform, I think, for us all to participate in. So I take it all as a cohesive element.
I think you need a bigger team. You need more people.
Well, and on that note, I'll share with you all. I did expand my team. It's been we are trying to put more folks in the seats. It's a tough market right now, but I am looking, and I've had some great success, and I've got some new folks who've come in, and so I'm feeling good about that. I do think also that one of the things I might have to leverage. You guys all talked about it, and I will be looking forward to some ideas as to, if there are stakeholders who want to formulate proposals, how does that get integrated into the stakeholder process? With, for example, the EDAM. I'll take EDAM because it's everybody's been talking about it. So let's take EDAM in the process. We didn't have working group structure where you were really looking at proposals from stakeholders. We were looking at ideas, thoughts, concerns, issues. What to focus on, what not to worry about. Now we're at the stage where we have a lot of questions in our straw proposal, and I would welcome if there's ideas on how to do things. And stakeholder community, I think BRIF specifically has to do it, but if there's a stakeholder community that wants to add some, value there, I think that would be great, and we want to look at that. But yes, we do need more people. I'm looking to hire more people, so let me know. But I also think you all have resources you have to consider. So when we talk about a roadmap, we don't look just at our resources. I can hire 100 more people to do this stuff, but you all have to keep up with us. And sometimes I hear that that's a challenge. And so that's part of the prioritization we try to look at, and the sequencing, and what does it mean for your businesses. So when you submit comments, it's important to consider that as well, so we can consider those as part of our decision.
And I just want to say I completely agree with Eric as far as BA priorities and something like the centralized buyer. It clearly has to be.
Yeah, we had to pop that right in. We had no choice.
and I think the point about Anna's resources are important. I think the other part though that we might need to look at as we coordinate this is there are some things that are not software dependent. And the transmission plan. In other words, you can do certain things in parallel. Other things, once you start dealing with software, may become more complex and have to sequence. And that's what I really think is we have to take a little bit more time on the planning and managing our own expectations about what's realistic for the ISO to do, because then it factors into what our planning is as far as when something can be done. Part of what you're hearing from at least me is a frustration of, if you tell me that this is not going to happen for 2 years, then okay, then we're managing, NV Energy's expectations about what that process is. If you tell me it's going to be 6 months, every 6 months over a 2-year window, it's a different feeling about it. And so we do have to be realistic. We do have to understand the priorities as both the BA and market operator. We can do certain things in parallel because different teams at the ISO are involved, different resources, and it may not have the same impact. But I do think trying to look at things in a pretty comprehensive way is vital on all fronts.
Yeah, I'm with you. In fact, I think one of the metrics that Anna and her team look at is not only how hard will the initiative be, but how hard will the implementation be. If something's going to take a long time, the policy and the implementation is really, really difficult, that may go to the bottom of the queue.
Actually, and that's a good point. And over the past 2 years, even before I entered in this role, we started looking at, in terms of implementation, what kind of, like to your point, Dave, what is it, software? Is it just processes? What kind of implementation, sequencing, and how long ahead of time do we start the implementation? We had this tradition, as you all know, we wouldn't start implementation until we had gone to the board in the old days, right? That was sort of the way we used to do things. And then we started thinking, well, sometimes you got to start that a little sooner. So now we're trying to factor in, if it takes 2 years to implement an enhancement, you might have to start the stakeholder initiative 2 years ahead of that. So, you have to take these things into consideration. It's the same thing as to how it impacts your business. And so those are all factors we look at. I like to think we have an open process, and I'm definitely open to hear more if folks feel that that's not open enough. And I will certainly be going back to thinking about some things we could do in terms of, how when we make changes in our process, if we're slipping behind on stuff. I will let you know that all of the stuff that you see on this roadmap and gets prioritized for the upcoming years actually makes its way through our corporate goals. So there is a scorecard, and we do report back where we're at, and if we're falling behind, both the Board of Governors and the governing bodies are briefed on a regular basis, so they know where we're at. So there is some visibility there, and this stuff does make its way directly into our corporate goals. So I just want to assure you that it doesn't go into the ether and somehow we don't, there are some measures around that. I like the idea maybe perhaps of a public scorecard. We do have on our website a page on which we provide information as to where each initiative is at, and you'll see it, each initiative has a timeline, and you'll see the timeline change if there's a delay in the board. Like, for example, we had the RDRR, the Reliability Demand Response Resource Initiative. We had to split that in two. We had started off thinking we were going to get it all done at once. We had to split it in two. We had to delay that. It went from being a May board meeting to a July board meeting. There was a change that had to happen. And because of new issues that we, felt we had to address as part of that, we needed a little bit more time. We try to provide that visibility. I'm definitely going to go back. It sounds like you guys are feeling there's not enough visibility in there and that criteria or how, what's going on. And I definitely want to hear more about that in terms of whether there's other things that you think I need to look at.
This is very helpful, Anne, and thank you for the consistent offers for us to give any feedback. If we are kind of running a bit tight on time, but did you have any closing thoughts, and you would like to still convey other than what you have? This is very helpful visual. And if there's no questions on the phone, if I recall. So we might want to start closing this out, if you don't mind. But this has been helpful for us. Any big picture?
Well, I mean, in terms of big picture, we are about to, in July, we'll start taking, actually June, I think, we start taking comments on the next round, and we'll be posting the roadmap. I do encourage everybody to, look at that closely and see if there's, any improvements to that process. Like I said, I will want to hear back about that, but I do encourage everybody to submit their comments in the time frame so we can look at that carefully. So by the end of the year, we can put together our next, if there's any changes to this. As you can see, we provide a 3-year look ahead, and you might need to, we might need to make some adjustments. We'll provide that later this year.
So I'll just say one thing. I think given the open challenge, the good challenge we've been given by Therese on behalf of GRC, one thing we might be discussing, and the next topic actually gets on it, is how we prioritize what issues RIF wants to work on. One of the things we will also start strategizing in the May meeting is where and how we want to give RIF comments on processes. So we might keep that in mind if RIF would have collective comments to give on the policy roadmap. And I will definitely be looking to my more veteran liaison colleagues to help shape that process.
Absolutely. And, we have
our process, of commenting, not your process.
Oh, right. But if you
I have to keep up many.
Yeah, just so you all know, and I think you all know this, but we have a process through which we collect comments
Yes.
for stakeholder initiatives. The roadmap follows a similar process. So you submit your comments through the same tool.
Okay.
And so, RIF can easily submit those comments. I know you have work to do at how that happens ahead of time, but it could certainly feed into the process quite easily.
Thank you.
Great, Vijay. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Just wanted to close out and thank Anna. Before I do close this topic, I have a public service announcement that I'm going to lean in a little harder to help both the RIF community prepare for these next steps. Can we go back to the slide that has the wheel? Okay, public service announcement. That is the wheel.
It's actually the second slide.
Sorry, I was like, oh, the wheel.
The wheel, the wheel,
Yeah, the wheel.
the calendar.
The cycle.
The annual cycle. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so the CAISO has done some process improvements already on this front. So I wanted to highlight one of them, commend the CAISO for doing this, acknowledge that. There is a link at the bottom of this slide for this form. I think there might be a tad bit of confusion because we've been talking a lot about comments. This particular form is accepted year-round, and I think the CAISO encourages you to do that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and actually, yeah, the catalog is at any time. You can submit information with the ISO at any time. There is sort of this like one thing that happens with stakeholder comments where we sometimes close the submission of comments, but we really do take input on the catalog at any time. But there's that period, up at the beginning of the part of the year where we update the the catalog so that we can integrate that into the roadmap for next year. So that's about basically is going on right now. You can submit the comments on updating the catalog because it makes its way to the roadmap for next year. So I think, Kathleen is pointing out there's a link there. You can submit it. I don't think it actually officially closes in July, but it's the way we like to get the comments in because then we start putting our roadmap together. So we want to get all that information in as soon as possible.
Yeah, no, and thank you for going through that detail a little bit. So we've heard feedback from our sector members that there's some confusion on the timing about it. And so we did want to make sure everyone on the line knows that this is the link. You can submit that tomorrow. If you have any specific issues you want to communicate to the CAISO, please do so. I know you've brought them up to us in our sector calls. This is the right tool to get it in front of the CAISO, and then we can always follow up with something more formal, but at least it'll get it in the catalog. Thanks.
And you could review the catalog itself. It's online. It's available to everybody, and it does get updated. Like I said, probably more than once a year, but at least once a year.
Hey, great. Thank you, Anne, for coming and staying longer after the YRAP CREPC meeting, and Kathleen for making this happen. When I joined the RIF, I kept hearing the policy catalog, and I frankly had no idea what all was in it. So I just trusted Kathleen and Matt to run with that agenda item. So thank you for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the feedback, and it's been a good meeting. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to move forward. This is Vijay, WRA. I think the next agenda item is exactly what was originally talked about at the beginning. What will RIF work on? What is our goals? What kind of interest areas we have? So while I request Eric in our audiovisual support team to help open up a screen with some priority topics, I just want to first share some thoughts here. When we first started the RIF in 2022, post-COVID, sort of post-COVID, there was a lot of questions and desire of what does the RIF want to take on this year? And I was a perfect guinea pig being new to being the chair. Everybody had a lot of ideas, so my colleagues who are the liaisons came up with a lot of questions, and Emily was very thoughtful to right away start typing away. And this is our initial brain dump of topics that seem to interest our liaison members. So in other words, the sectors in some ways may have opined on these, some have not yet. So for those who are on the phone, and if you've seen this for the first time, please don't worry, the train's not left the station. For those who have seen this but are interested, please take the time to reach out to your sector liaisons to comment on them. There are around like 11 or 12 of them, but we have not nailed down the specifics of what issues RIF should take on. But this will be good news in a way for the GRC and the governing body that we're going to try to keep an eye on leveraging what topics we want to discuss or have debates or discussions on in ways that can overlay with some of the trending issues as well. So we're going to try to see where we can have some common areas of interest. These topics, thank you, Eric, these topics also are going to be sliced and diced to reflect, and I wish Kathleen, she just stepped out, but I was going to make her happy. We were also going to try to meet the item number 4 to explore some deep dive topics on some of these that deserves more attention, that some of my liaison colleagues have identified to be the need. So Emily is going to have this spreadsheet posted to the RIF website. Please give us a day or two. But Eric, we'll go back to the main slides, please. Thank you. But I think where we're going with this, I want to just speak to what is our goal. The goal is to identify a manageable, I should have put that in bold, underlined, red font, a manageable and relevant list of topics that enables the RIF to execute its purpose and serve the larger intent, which technically fits in items 3 and 4, developing a process for how we will give feedback, but also what kind of issues does RIF want to take on this year in addition to the governance conversations that will be coming to us constantly. So I just want to highlight 2 swim lanes we're going to be in: trending issues, governance conversations. So just want to highlight for everybody the realities there. So my suggestion or request, this is a totally Vijay idea. I thought, why don't I throw some thoughts out for the sector liaisons to think about, and we're going to meet on May 26th. And I asked Holly if I could lock the conference room so we can't get out till we agree, but I'm told I can't do that. That's a joke. The point being, I think we do want to nail down in May or early June a manageable list of 5 or 6 items out of the 12 that RIF sector liaisons by consensus feel comfortable. And why is it relevant to you? What kind of engagement do you want? Like today, we had Ann McKenna come and do an open discussion. Is that adequate for your topic, or you would like more specific response? Or like in some cases, the DMM has done analysis. So if Dave Rubin is very keen to have a question addressed and you want some justification for this issue, then maybe you could convey to your sector liaison and say, on this topic, I would like X, Y, Z, and I would like this assessment or explanation. So understanding what kind of feedback you really want will be helpful, because if RIF is truly going to be giving advice, we should truly try to be specific on what issues we want addressed and in what nature. And that gets me to the last point I wanted to bring up. And for those who may have known me, may not, at WEC, I employed this strategy. It helped bring members to the table rather than, I think the North Star is there, and somebody looks to the south and says the North Star is there. So what is your end state out of these topics? So that'd be my request, that I'll be collectively challenging the sector liaisons together in our May 26th meeting. And our hope is to narrow down to 5 topics, 5 or 6 out of the 12. I simply did a simple math called divide by 2 out of 12. So if we narrow to 12 out of 6 out of 12, pick a couple of them you want hard analysis from CalISO staff, identify what and where. So let's really be productive and focused for the next 6 months, and hopefully we can make some progress. And then whoever's the chair next year can take over what we still want pending. But by then governance is also going to be trotting along. So then our hands are in these 2 areas at least. So it doesn't take care of other items, how RIF will engage, formal, informal, but that's my suggestion and proposal for the value proposition of what topics you all wish to work on. Open to feedback or questions.
Josh Walter, Seattle City Light. I remembered this time. Thanks for not having to prompt. So one, maybe not an amendment, but maybe just an addition to that last ideal end state.
Sure.
Is the timing component of the particular issue. You know, with the new charge after the first round of the GRC, is that the expectation is that we will be providing some level of input to the governing body. So with that in mind, that input being tied to a particular decision point in the governing body's process, I think is an important element to the work that we're doing. So I would just say to keep that in mind, that, you know, specific to the conversation we just had in the roadmap, maybe looking at the roadmap coupled with looking at our list, seeing if there's a sweet spot of of issues that could be discussed at a loose, I won't say defined, but a loosely defined governing body meeting where that particular issue may be coming up. So I think, long story short, we should also have a lens of a timing component to meet with the governing body to provide some level of whatever the end state for that particular issue is decided to be.
Very good feedback. I don't know how I forgot the timing thing when I myself said we in this 1 year what all we want to work on. So I know I took this down, not just the timing of the prioritization, but what checkpoints we want on which of the topics and where. And especially if something's coming up for voting, do we want to go further up earlier and give an update? And where voting is not involved, but it can influence the GB decision making on next steps where we want to get involved. So I think a path dependency can also be done. So you just helped me confirm our work for May 26th. And for those on the phone, the RIF liaisons will be meeting on May 26th. We have a meeting and we hope to work through this area a lot. One other item I wanted to just flag is we've had an informal brainstorming conversation, but there's been a desire or request even from the GRC and GB also in a way informally that we try to give some regular updates. So the one idea I wanted to propose is as these topics get finalized, we will give a bit of a written summary of which topics, why, and what is the basis, but maybe there we can identify what stakeholder process like Anne was showing, could this be impacting if at all? So I think that may be another way of tagging to this where necessary. And I don't expect RIF to have consensus on all, but I think at least let's try to have consensus on the topics we pick. But some people may engage more. I may be least involved in one, but Matt, please.
Yeah, I was reminded. Matt Lacar with Pacific Gas and Electric, PTO sector liaison. I was reminded, in the early days, the RIF kind of made a point of when we would say solicit speakers on a topic, getting a non-CAISO-centric view of things. Mm-hmm. I can remember, for example, on market power mitigation, we brought in Potomac Economics that does market enforcement in all of the eastern markets, right? So that we, as a stakeholder community, had a broader perspective, like Kathleen brought in from her PJM experience. I thought it was, absolutely fascinating to hear, how the stakeholder engagement process works in another RTO. So, maybe part of the form of engagement is also not just desire CAISO staff response, but like, who else would we like to hear from on a topic? And I think that can be a really valuable function that RIF can provide, is to bring in, I'll say that broader, industry perspective from wherever these same issues have been encountered and dealt with differently.
Well said. I took that as raise awareness, create more expertise sharing. So guest speakers, experts. So what you were saying, the form of engagement could be very diverse. It doesn't have to be only.
And it could be broader than just consulting with the CAISO staff that are engaged. It could be like, I would like to know, how this particular governance issue is treated in MISO, PJ. I don't have time to read through the SPP tariff, but, I'm sure that each of those entities has their own expertise that we could tap.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Anybody else has any thoughts, comments? So I think we just agree that, and Kathleen, I think, welcome back, but sorry, we were just talking through this process, as you're aware, and we're going to meet on May 26th and work through the topics to be prioritized. Does anybody on the phone have any questions or comment? Okay. That's all I have to present today on this matter. We're just setting the stage, as I said. And now we move to the last agenda item, which is, frankly, the roundtable. I like to joke sometimes it's a free country. So I think we really are still in, luckily. So any thoughts, other ideas, questions that you feel the agenda has not addressed, but you would like everybody to be informed of. Anybody on the phone, please? It's truly a roundtable. Okay, hearing none, I see everybody being kind of either super happy this was a good meeting or super ready to leave. Anybody on the phone has any thoughts, questions, final? Hey, I thank you all for the first RIF meeting post-COVID. And thank you to the guest speakers and especially Therese coming in, and to Meg and Matt and Kathleen for really helping Josh and I. So thank you all, and thanks CalISO staff. We'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.